Hello lovelies. Today we're going to take a look at the Dungeons & Dragons Rules Cyclopedia. So this combines Basic, Expert, Companion, Master and bits of Immortal, which were the multicoloured box sets of like how to learn to play D&D books that you used to find in stores back in the 80s. Now I have somewhere a couple of boxes of Basic and Immortals, weirdly, because when I bought my first Basic box, the Immortal handbook was tucked inside it. So I had Basic and Immortal and nothing in between, which was very confusing. As regular viewers of the channel will know and be bored of hearing, I didn't start with D&D. This seems to be an experience that is more common in England, Britain, even more common on the continent, where things like the Dark Eye and so on were people's introduction to role-playing games. But yeah, as seems peculiar for Americans, at least, D&D was not my introduction to the hobby, and frankly I think that's been very good for British game design. It's kind of like how the ZX Spectrum was good for British computer game design, because we raised a whole bunch of bedroom coders, right? Similarly, because we didn't start with D&D, we tended to play a much broader variety of different games. Of course, that came to an end in the early 90s, about when this came out, when Games Workshop stopped selling RPGs. But I digress, which is a habit of mine. So my first encounter with BECMI really was playing a game of Basic with a nerdy friend of mine from secondary school, who was very good at maths and still works in maths, last I checked in on him. I did not have a good time with it, because I successfully snuck up on a dragon and described how it was, God knows what a dragon was doing against a first level PC, but I successfully drove my sword into its eye, and that wasn't a backstab apparently, so it didn't even do double damage when it probably should have killed the thing outright after being slid into its brain. But yeah, that left me with a bit of a bitter taste towards D&D from then on. So BECMI is of a different D&D lineage to AD&D. The game lines kind of split in two ways. Some people think that this offshoot started with the Holmes version in 1977. Some consider the Holmes version to be its own peculiar inbred mutant offspring of D&D that kind of sits on its own. Some say the sort of BECMI line started out with the BX set, Basic Expert set from 1981, which was intended to hook people into AD&D and convince them to play that more than as its own product. But certainly and unequivocally, BECMI was the Mensa version, published from 1983 and end capped by the Rules Cyclopedia at the end in 1991. So that's considered to be like the run, which seems short when you consider how long 5th edition's been going. The time between editions for some games seems to have been climbing in recent years, perhaps reflecting the expense of the books and the relative cost and so on that we all have imposed upon us now. So the Rules Cyclopedia was published in 1991 as this sort of end cap on this whole side evolution of D&D, and the whole story of BECMI is a bit of a weird one that I've never really seen replicated elsewhere in the hobby. the idea of a set of books that deliberately start very simple and easy and then add complications and rules as you go along. I mean, that's kind of how all games naturally evolve. You have a core book and you have supplements, and the supplements introduce new monsters, new interpretations of the rules, new optional ways of playing, and so on. And then when a new edition does come out, it kind of rationalizes and trims down what you've got, or perhaps unwisely revises things that you shouldn't. But generally speaking, I find that the second edition of any game is usually the best one. But usually this kind of expansion is unplanned and piecemeal. It's a bit here in an adventure, it's a bit there in an additional player's guide or a class guide or whatever else. In BECMI, this building was deliberate and planned. So now the closest thing we probably have is you have a starter set and then you have the main game, but the starter sets are usually stripped back versions that may even lack things like creating your own character rules. So they're stripped back and they're designed to tease you into buying the proper game far more than they are a deliberately evolving structure from the starter set to the main book or points in between or even beyond. Starter sets can be a nice cheap way to get some card miniatures, maps, sets of dice and so on, but they are kind of for suckers, and it's not really the same thing in a lot of ways. Oh, and I'm a sucker, in case you think I'm insulting you. Apparently the Cyclopedia is missing the specific Immortals content. I couldn't find my book to dig out, so yeah, I've got it somewhere, so I'm not missing that material. So I guess this is technically Beckham, not BECMI. So you could call it David if you like football. I don't. So it's a bit of a weird book, sitting on that bridge between the 1980s design aesthetic and content and the 1990s shift in gaming as a whole in terms of presentation, art, quality, and all the rest of it. I mean, this looks properly laid out, while a lot of the earlier books look like technical manuals put together on someone's typewriter. You know, there's a definite divide here, and being the end cap on that 1980s line of games also puts this in a weird sort of position. I mean, even the idea of having two versions of your same game kind of dividing along, that's peculiar. It's not something people would normally do, but you know, TSR's business acumen was never that great. Plus, this is rules. This isn't setting. There's a very small amount of information on either the implied setting or the specific setting that was in the gazetteers, I think. It's broadly compatible with AD&D or older editions as well, but it's different enough from AD&D to be either interesting or irritating, depending on your particular point of view. And it's weird to see so many ideas in the abandoned BECMI line that ended up reappearing in one form or another in third edition, right? So you can see the genesis of third edition's prestige classes. When you reach 9th level, you become a named character, essentially, and you can specialize in a subclass of your main class. For most character classes, that is a differential between a wandering version of the character and a homebody version of the character, though they go to pains to let you know that you can still go out and adventure. So clerics can either settle down and become wards of a certain area, or they can just wander. Fighters can become paladins, knights, or avengers. Magic users can become wizards, magists, or magi. Thieves can become guildmasters or wandering rogues. You're a bit more constricted if you're playing races class like dwarves or elves or halflings, but you can see the genesis of 3rd edition's prestige classes in the way that works, and that's certainly very interesting. Another oddity is that you have druids as specialized clerics. So you would start out as a nature cleric, perhaps of a neutral deity, and then at 10th level, if you're using the optional rules, you can elect to become a druid instead of one of the other specializations. So that's a little peculiar. We have a couple of extra classes as well. The mystics one sort of stands out. That's basically the monk, but with much more emphasis on the meditation and becoming an ultimate sandwich, one with everything, more than it is kicking people's ass with martial arts, though that is still an aspect of the class. Japan is on my mind a lot recently, so they remind me of the Sohei, the warrior monks, since they're good with spears as well. There's other little oddments here and there, like there's a skill system where you can buy skills starting at 0, and what you have to do with your skills is you have to roll under the appropriate statistic. Ooh, I rolled a 1. That's a critical success. And then your skill level past 0 modifies that target number that you have to roll under upwards, and plus circumstances and so on can either increase your effective stat or decrease your effective stat by up to a maximum of 15, either way. So that's quite a sort of simple way of going about it. Weirdly though, because this is old D&D, there is a whole separate system for weapon mastery rather than just making weapon mastery into skills, and through weapon mastery you can gain bonuses to attack, bonuses to damage. There are penalties if you are not au fait with a particular weapon, and weapons also have special effects, potential special effects, which can trigger, and the better trained you are in those various concepts and ideas, then the more likely those special effects are to trigger. So just off the top of my head, it's probably not actually an example in the rules, but if you had a sai, you know, one of those Japanese forked sword catcher things, and you got a certain dice roll when you're parrying or whatever, and that might be expanded out. If you have mastery in the weapon, then you can disarm your opponent, that sort of thing. It's probably not an example that's actually in here, but it shows you the kind of thing. So I don't really know why they bothered separating the weapon mastery from the main skill system. It doesn't particularly gain anything from being separate. This is a complete game with a lot of rules that you may not end up using. You've got mass combat rules, morale rules, stronghold rules, numerous variants on how you might choose to play. It's a complete toolkit. And this is what a lot of OSR games seem to be striving back towards. Basically, cutting and trimming what we have here into a more digestible and better presented set of rules. Each table's house rules now seems to get published in some way or another, and that's fine. That's cool. That's good as far as I'm concerned. It's back to the old punk zine ethos, if not aesthetic, in a lot of ways. Modern OSR stuff tends to not be quite so anal as this is, and seems to lack a lot of the wargame influence that is fairly apparent throughout this, and minus a lot of the additional complications, or stripping back a lot of the complications that in many cases really could use rationalizing down. So then, if I have to review it, which seems odd for such an old game book, the Rule Cyclopedia is an odd duck. The whole BECMI sideline is an odd duck. It's a hard read. It's old-fashioned even for 1991, even for the tail end of the 1980s. Though the artwork in here is more typical of the artwork that most game companies did in the 90s, and it certainly has a lot more whimsy and character to it that is so absent from modern D&D art. It's characterful, it's dynamic, it's not muddy because it's black and white. I mean, here's a Cyclops wizard in a star-covered robe with magic glowing from his hands, facing off against some sort of pair of African adventurers. I mean, what? Who knows? So the execution is not necessarily up to modern standards, but it is much more effective, characterful, inspiring than what we tend to see today. So one of the technical limitations let it down, and this is obviously a reprint, which doesn't help. Star-wise, I'm gonna give it a high 3. In terms of substance, it has everything, but it has everything as a summary of everything that is in all those individual box sets. And additional optional material taken from here, there, and everywhere. But it is a summary of that material. It lacks a great deal of, frankly, necessary explanation and examples and so on. So this is meant to be, I think, a reference book for those who already own the other things. But we're in a different position here today, where you would probably just buy this, to be honest, if you had to buy anything. I mean, you don't want to give wizards too much money, do you? So it's missing a lot of the examples and so on, and so that can make this an intimidating and overwhelming read, since you're consuming raw rules data all at once, rather than spread out over 5 more digestible box sets that gradually introduce new concepts and new ideas as you go along. So yeah, style high 3, substance 4, 7 out of 10, 3.5 out of 5. I would collect this and the original boxes if you can, because the prices have been going up and up and up as long as I've been aware of it. And it would be better to read through and absorb the different sets in order to learn what's in there, and then just to use this for reference, which was its original purpose. If you're an OSR designer or a gaming historian, which is increasingly my role, of course, this is definitely worth your shekels. But honestly, the many OSR options you have out there are more readable, better presented. They're just slightly incomplete because they're all house rules. But at this point, Wizards of the Coast deserves as little of your money as possible. But I think the modern OSR is now better in so many ways than what it was spawned from, and this is an example of that. Maybe I can say that because I don't have the nostalgia for the original D&D games that so many people do have. And it's not like my design philosophy is particularly in line with the modern OSR, or old D&D for that matter. But yeah, definitely at this point I would say the OSR is much improved over what inspired it in just about every way possible. I mean, my recommendations would always be for Lamentations of the Flame Princess, and similarly pruned down, simplified, characterful, and more digestible versions of games that are rooted in BECMI but aren't BECMI and aren't bogged down by a lot of the wargaming ideas and conceptions that you find throughout this. But if you want the same level of detail, and worse or better, depending on your point of view, then maybe Adventurer Conqueror King would more probably be your best bet. Yeah, I was never a D&D guy. but this is an interesting peek into 1980s D&D, its mindset, its design philosophy, a summary of everything that came before, an end cap on that 80s period, and something that hints at what was to come in the 1990s through to 2003rd edition. I certainly appreciate this more now than I would have back then, when I would have scoffed at it for being old-fashioned, overly complex, and no fun. Zang.
Sure, you could play one of those hoity-toity horror games where the most horrifying thing that happens is someone wearing a corset who really shouldn't. Or you could grind a zombie's face into a belt sander.
Well, I look at it myself as the beginning, really, of an exploration. That's the reason we're exploring. You don't know what you'll run into on an exploration. What the sky looks like, what the stars look like. Do they still twinkle, or are they a steady light when you get outside the atmosphere?